On here. So welcome. Okay, you're all in for like a huge treat today. I'm here with my bestie, Joy Anderson, who has spent the last year helping me to understand power. She sees things at this systems level and can deconstruct what's actually going on underneath the surface, which we all need to learn if we're going to transform our systems. So we're going to talk today about this stunning paper that she wrote, Disrupting Power Dynamics in Fields. And there are 6 key elements to it. We're going to deal with a few of them today, and get underneath the surface so you can actually see what's going on. And we're going to use SheEO as an example for some of these. So, Joy, shall we start with, do you want me to read through the 6? Or how do you want to?
You can, by all means, go ahead. I just realized I'm jumping out of the other session in the process metrics, realizing Criterion sounds like frameworks are us, but Elisa did such a great job. So, but dive in, yeah.
Okay, cool. If you want to know more about Joy, just Google her. I'm not going to do her bio stuff right now. Okay, so the 6 elements around power dynamics that we want to talk about are what we need to do to get to the new world is dismantle privilege through the redistribution of resources. We need to redefine value by challenging and resetting norms. We need to expand who holds authority through diverse leadership. We need to honor knowledge that's validated by experts and grounded in context. I know this is a bit heady, but stay with me. You need to open participation through new patterns of trusted connections. And then we need to equitably distribute power through accountable, transparent structures. So why don't we start with challenging and resetting norms, Joy, and get us underneath the surface on that one.
Yep, absolutely. And I think what I've noticed, and I've spent the last 20 years working on building fields and, was part of early days in impact investing, launching an early venture fund. And then I think, as many of you might know, Criterion was quite accountable and responsible in the early days of gender lens investing in terms of framing some of the early thinking there. And so there is this work of how we decide what gets challenged. How do we decide what systems change is needed? How do we look at the frame, and as you did, looking at how people were funding women-led businesses and say, crap, this is not working and we need a different frame, right? And so much of that is broadly thought of as field building. And so many of you actually do this in your day-to-day lives of thinking about not just your own role, but how are things connected? Because how things are connected at a systems level shapes a lot of what we think is possible. So this first one around cultural norms. I was a high school teacher before I went into finance, and long story, which I won't tell. But the reality is I didn't know financial terms, right? And you had that moment where people would say, sweetie, I'll just explain to you how this works. And for a long time, I internalized that, right? And I thought I needed to hear how it works because there was something about how it works that I didn't understand. But what I've learned over time is so much of that is a cultural norming process, right? Because guess who gets to define how it works? The people who are benefiting from the existing system, right? So how do we keep that an open process? So when people say, well, what we need to show, or my favorite moments, how much money has really moved in gender lens investing? Really? Is it really real? And I'm like, seriously, people? We started at a negative with not enough capital moving to women-led businesses, and you're going to measure whether or not we're moving more money? We should be talking about, are we moving it better, smarter? Is it useful? But this more is such a norm in finance because the more assets you have under management, the bigger your, whatever it is you're trying to define as big, right? And so that kind of norming of naming it by the numbers and saying you're valuable if you're bigger. And I know SheEO has had this feedback. Like people are like, $1,000? I mean, what are you really doing? If somebody moves $1,000, that's not real money.
Yeah.
All right. Anybody listening to this, you know how much $1,000 of SheEO money is more real than lots of other money. But that's not the question we ask, right? We ask whether or not it's enough, or does that really show chutzpah? And this other piece about just designing for, I mean, I think one of the things that SheEO has done is sort of turn on the head, a lot of what we see in norms is you have to understand what investors want. I mean, we're told this all the time. Well, you really have to appeal to the investors. Well, that's not really what investors want. Well, we really have to think about what the investor wants and what the investor wants and their intent. And so we turn ourselves into pretzels, literally, to be able to meet the demands of the investor, which gets overly constructed as an investor who looks a lot like a VC, who wants a high scale, a high impact, really quickly, deliver all for this right now. We're not designing for what the companies need. Why aren't we? Like, I mean, trust me, I just want to name it as a power dynamic, right? But it's so ingrained that we design investments to meet the needs of investors. Well, we don't have to. Why don't we design investments to meet the needs of the companies who are producing the economic value that the investors are gaining from, right? And so these aren't uncommon ideas. They sound really radical. And so the one thing I also want to say is I'm really pragmatic at some level. I mean, I like pushing things, but I like pushing things because if they're not working, let's examine the assumptions underneath it and find something else. Anyway, for me, that's why the norming piece is so important, because we're so engrossed in the norms of how finance works that we prove the gender's material. We prove that women entrepreneurs have a business case. Like nobody, our common friend Tracy Gray took me to task the other day. She's just like, I want Criterion to do a study of white male boards. Has anybody ever proven that they're actually useful, right? But like, how do we reframe what the question is so that we're not constantly on this defensive because we're told, sorry, I get excited about this topic.
I mean, it's exactly the thing. Like SheEO is designed 100% from the lens of the entrepreneur, right? Knowing what I know about entrepreneurs, having been an entrepreneur forever, if I was redesigning the finance system from the entrepreneur's lens, this is SheEO's the answer, right? Like that's how we did it. I didn't think about the investors at all. I'm like, they're gifting their money, and then stand back, trust, and here we go. And so it was quite radical. I mean, entrepreneurs were like, hello, sign me up, right? But a lot of people who came from a sort of traditional finance lens were like, what is this? And I still remember you saying to me at the beginning, you must have taken every single bug that you saw in the system, is the software language, and just like, design something for all the bugs in the world, like just flip it around completely. So let's get a little bit, go.
To that though, Vicki, because I was at some of those early SheEO meetings, right? I remember I still have PTSD from that, some one round table that you had where you were just being grilled, but that's not how it works, but that's not how it works. But why are you changing everything about how it works? How are we changing that? Why don't you it's just be great if you could keep that part in place, because it makes me really comfortable and feel safe. So the question of those early days and what it took to continue to rip it apart and look underneath it. Just honoring that.
Yeah, I mean, I was at a table. I think there were like 12 women or something, and it was so good to have you there because they were all in finance and they kept picking at every single thing. Well, what about this? And how come? Because they were trying to get it to fit into their model, their mental model of the way things are. And to have you witness me in that experience was very helpful. Thank you. Because I was just very used to the fact that I had to constantly defend myself. And you're like, hello, wait a minute, what's going on here? And after that, I felt a little emboldened. So thank you for that piece. So let's talk about who has authority. Do you want to go there next?
Yeah. Well, and it's So one of the things that we've noticed in the field, in building the field of gender lens investing, one of the things I find honestly most tragic is that in gender lens investing, knowledge of finance is privileged. Not knowledge of a gendered experience, not awareness of the impact of gender-based violence on women's understanding of themselves and their own safety, not the ability to look at power. What's honored and what we continue to sort of privilege is people who know finance. And in some ways, that's great, because you've got what happened in early days of impact investing, right? As you had this, and sustainable finance, as you had a flood of people who had knowledge in investing coming into a conversation about social change where they were newcomers, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm sorry, I'm seeing all these chats of like, can we drop these 7 into the list? Yeah, it's a yay. Anyway, so in the early days there was this, and even like in 2001, sort of after the .com sort of all kinds of people sort of showing up and saying, I've found social change and you should be extraordinarily grateful that I have all of this finance knowledge. And so what I can do is show up with my finance knowledge and then tell you all of the ways that we can improve your social impact because I know finance. And we've never flipped that dialogue. We're still grateful that systems of finance have showed up in social change, but we haven't yet fully reclaimed the voice of social change. And again, I think this is part of what SheEO is doing with the people working on the world's to-do list, because they're the ones working in context who are saying, here is what's happening in Indigenous communities in Canada, and this is what is needed, and our knowledge, our data matters, right? And so how do we, and the way we tell our stories, how do we shift whose knowledge matters and who's seen as expert?
Yeah.
So that being somebody who understands context becomes expert.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I just feel like we got outside validation for the first time around this, with a bank actually matching contributions to what we're doing, because we are saying that everybody has expertise, no matter what age or stage you're at. We are making decisions on how to allocate capital based on collective intelligence. About 50% of people don't look at financials at all when we're allocating capital. Holy what? And it works. And we have payback rates that are better than banks. And so the bank is like, that's fascinating. How does that happen? We need to go on the journey, because it's clearly not a mistake. It's happened now 15 cohorts in a row. There's something going on here that's interesting. And again, though, like, people do need to experience that in order to believe. Right. So we have a reality here, you know?
Right. Well, and I also think I was caught in a conversation. Actually, Elisa and I were on a conversation yesterday where we were talking about a community leader who knows her community inside and out, and she's doing some radical experimentations on new approaches to finance. And we're sort of helping her think, in this case, actually about her process metrics. And she was playing this out of sort of how she's doing. And we're like, well, gee, your processes aren't really documented that clearly. I'm like, all right. Why do we care if their processes are documented clearly? Why is that the sign of legitimacy, right? We go into all kinds of investment shops and we're like, how do you do stuff? And they're like, oh no, we do a process, then we check our guts, and then we make an investment, right? So at some point we should just name large parts of finance are do some stuff, check your gut, move stuff. But we have to figure out, how do we trust different guts? Right? Yeah. How do we trust people who have a different grounding, a different way of knowing, a different way of being embedded in and then learn to validate that? Because somebody introduced themselves on we spend our lives on Zoom these days, but this woman got on the call, freaking genius woman, and she walked through and she said, well, it's not for me about my credentials. Of course I have them. It's not, of course, about my years of legal experience advocate, but of course I've done that, right? And it was just a beautiful, like,
Nice.
deconstructing of expertise without letting them get away with saying, well, then she's not really real, is she? But we all play that. Like, the work that all of I'm watching all these amazing names fly by. What all of us are challenged to do is to stand in the face of systems that work in a certain way that weren't designed to work for us. They just weren't.
Yeah.
And so we have to have an enormous amount of grace for ourselves and our colleagues to say, sometimes we just have to live within the system it is and play the game the way it's played, because that's the only way we're going to get to play it all. And so, yes. And we're not crazy.
Yeah.
Right? Not designed to work for what we want to get done. And so not sort of having that both and of, sometimes I have to play complete within the systems, figure out the system's rules and push on it. And sometimes I just have to say that the emperor has no clothes. And honestly, got to challenge the questions.
Yeah. And again, like, having had a ton of experience through the systems of how things are supposed to work, et cetera, it was also my experience over and over that the truth underneath that is that nobody knows. No one knows how to pick winners. No one, nobody. And in fact, every unbelievable angel investor I know is like 100% tuned to intuition.
Yeah.
They're just like, gut, this person's going to figure it out. And this whole prove to me first thing, which is so painful. Like, I don't know how many people I've been in relationship with getting this off the ground where they're like, how's that going to scale though? How are you going to get to sustainability?
Right.
I don't believe in your model. I'm like, trust me, this thing needs to exist in the world and we will figure out how to get to sustainability. But like telling you in advance how that's going to happen, no can do. And I recently learned that the word planning comes from the root plano in Latin, which means illusion. Hello. Like, it's an illusion to think that you know what's going to happen in advance. Anyway, but again, back to the trust, well.
And I think there's, so one of my role models on the planet is this woman, Catherine Collins, who works at Putnam Investment. If you haven't read The Nature of Investing, I loved it. It was called The Walden Pond for Investing at some point. It's just a lovely book. But recently, Catherine was named the most successful ESG, her portfolio was the most successful ESG portfolio by a lot last year. And the way she looks at things is she finds the leaders in public equities where she works that are seeing the future, that are eyes wide open, that are actually looking at changes. And at some point, we have to start recognizing that that being aware of social movements, seeing the shifts that are happening around social justice is about seeing the future. That's not about just seeing the problems today. That's about seeing who are the leaders in the future. And we have to value that as a form of, as the knowledge we need to be trusting. But that's not what gets spun out of our current financial systems deal books. And so how do we create that different narrative of a future where power dynamics are being disrupted by us?
Okay, last minute. Give me an action. What do you want us to do? What do we all need to do?
Be aware of your own power. Start by an assessment of, because I feel people get tripped up by be aware of your own power. Second, think about what you're willing to risk, because the reality is none of us will have power if we don't take risks, right? So I can't say anything in that meeting. Okay, you might be right. Are you sure? Are you sure you can't say anything? What if you asked somebody before the meeting, did a little scheming, and had somebody say it with you, right? What are the ways that you can bring in allies? And so for me, the first step is to really understand our own power and to widen our willingness to take risks with that power. And then figure out how can we use that power. What I feel most important, I am very aware of how much privilege I have in my life. And what I want to be able to do is give air cover anytime I can so that other people can step out in ways that where they're not safe. Because in the end, I am.
Thank you for using your power to support me too. Love you.
Love you too.
See you all back in the main room, folks. You heard it here. Joy Anderson.